Hey everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. We've got a very fun episode for you today. We're going to be taking a look at the discography of Queens of the Stone Age, a group that has been a key contributor to the alt-rock and alt-metal world for the past 25 years, and they are still going strong to this day, and stylistically have gone in a lot of different directions throughout their current 8-album discography. And because of that, you do see a lot of diversity of thought within the Queens of the Stone Age community. I really love seeing how different people rank their albums, because there might be a few albums that a lot of people mutually regard as being amazing, but I will say that of all of the groups that I've covered in my lists up to this point, I think Queens of the Stone Age is one of the groups that has the most wide-ranging opinions when it comes to how people rank their albums, and I've heard people make convincing arguments for almost every single one of their records and why they could be regarded as one of the best of their discography. And today I will add my personal album rankings to those very diverse and wide-ranging sets of opinions that are out there. And what I'm going to do is go through their 8 studio albums, starting with Queens of the Stone Age and going up to In Times New Roman, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 8 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut self-titled album from 1998 titled Queens of the Stone Age, and I will give this one a B. I will say, of all the albums in their discography, this was actually the one that I had to think about the most, and it took the most amount of listens, because initially I had put it in A tier, but then as I was going through and making the video and comparing it to their other records, it did feel more fitting ultimately to put it in B tier, but there are certainly some things that I love about this album regardless of that. This record was written after the breakup of Caius, which was the prior group that Josh Homme and Alfredo Hernandez had been a part of, amongst other people, but Josh and Alfredo would be the two main people credited for this album and the two principal songwriters. And this is the only album where we are going to get this lineup, so I think naturally anytime that happens, it is to be expected that the music that you're going to write is going to differentiate itself from the later part of your discography, and I think ultimately why so many people have so many varying opinions on this album has to do with what side of the Queens of the Stone Age sound you resonate with the most, because if you are a big Caius fan, then it would not be surprising that this could be one of your favorite Queens of the Stone Age records, but if somebody resonates more with the direction that they would take on Rated R and Songs for the Deaf, then it can be understandable that this wouldn't be one of your favorites, and I do tend to fall into that second camp more so it's more of a stylistic preference for me rather than a quality thing, because objectively, I do think this is a very good album, and there aren't any songs on here that I would regard as like bad songs, but there are a couple of songs that I wouldn't say are the most exciting tracks to come from Queens of the Stone Age, and with the exception of one track, I wouldn't say any of the songs on here would be regarded as any of my favorite Queens of the Stone Age songs, which is another reason why it felt more fitting to put this one in B tier. I think it opens incredibly strong. The first 3 songs in particular I think are all very solid, with Regular John, Avon, and If Only. Regular John showcases their gritty and driving guitar riffs with some very cool falsetto vocal melodies on top of it, and is a great introduction to their vibe. On this record in particular, sometimes Josh's falsetto can remind me of early Tom York, which I find very fascinating and have always wondered if anyone else feels the same way. Avon would be hands down my favorite song from this album, and this is the one song that I had mentioned that would make my list of top 10 favorite Queens of the Stone Age songs. In my opinion, this song just has it all. It's got a cool single note guitar riff, really dark and heavy chord movements, and a super catchy and tasteful vocal melody on top of it. And If Only is a great track for showcasing their catchier, more hook-based style of writing, and I think those 3 tracks are just a rock-solid succession of songs to bring the album in, and I would say at this point I do think the highest part of the album has occurred, because from this point on I do enjoy the majority of the remainder of the record, but it also does have a couple of skip-over tracks for me here and there, which naturally is going to affect the momentum a little bit. And musically, I would say this is probably their most vanilla sounding album in terms of the riffs and the grooves and just general writing style. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I do think that from album 2 and onward, they do veer into more adventurous music territories and start to explore more different stylistic realms, which we don't get as much on this initial record. For the remainder of the album, the other standout tracks for me would be You Would Know, Mexicola, You Can't Quit Me Baby, and Give the Mule What He Wants. All very solid tracks, and in general, I would say most of this album is very good. There are a couple of skip-overs here and there for me, but it is by no means a bad album. It's just more the fact that during this transitional period where the band is still developing their sound, it does leave something to be desired for me and doesn't resonate with me as much as a lot of the stuff that would follow it. But regardless of that, it's still a very cool album with a handful of really solid tracks and not a bad debut album by any stretch. So I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have their second studio album from 2000 titled Rated R, and I will give this an S. Incredible album and a big improvement from the first release in my opinion. This was the first album to feature co-writing and vocals from Nick Oliveri, who was also a member of Caius, as well as vocalist Mark Lanigan guest featuring and contributing to some of the songwriting. And stylistically, this one does branch out much more from the debut album with lots of versatility from song to song, combining alt rock and alt metal with some of the more stoner rock elements. Lots of drug references all throughout these tracks, and in general, I just think musically this one is much more interesting and dynamic than the first record, where I think we really get our first taste of that classic Queens of the Stone Age sound that they are most well known for. The album is 11 tracks long, clocking in at a little over 42 minutes in length, and I think from front to back, this record is very consistent and is a very enjoyable listen. The shifts in mood and the variety from track to track make for a very adventurous and enjoyable experience, and it really keeps you on the edge of your seat. The record opens up with the two singles, which are Feel Good Hit of the Summer and The Lost Art of Keeping a Secret, both amazing and classic Queens of the Stone Age songs, and they bring the album in the best way possible. Some other favorites of mine on here would be Better Living Through Chemistry, which has such a dark and eerie groove to it with this really colorful vocal melody. Absolutely love that track. And a couple of other favorites of mine would be Quick and to the Pointless, which gives us our hardest hitting number of the record with awesome screaming vocals from Nick Oliveri. And I also love the closing track, I Think I Lost My Headache, which is a nice heavy 8.5 minute track that goes into all sorts of cool directions and eventually drops down to just a horn section playing the guitar figures and wraps the album up on this great, intense, and just very interesting note. And the first half of the song definitely sounds to me like a precursor to where they were going to go stylistically on their next album, Songs for the Deaf, and I think it's an amazing closer to an amazing album. The only song that I've never been able to get into on this record is Leg of Lamb. Not sure why, but that's the one track that has just never grown on me, no matter how many times I've listened to it. But other than that, I think the remainder of this album is very strong, with a more expanded palette of sounds that they are drawing upon, and a record where I think they really firmly established that classic Queens of the Stone Age sound, and it would give them a great jumping off point to continue to expand their sound on future records. So an awesome album, a big improvement upon the first release. This one gets an S. Okay, next we have their third studio album from 2002 titled Songs for the Deaf, and I will give this one an S. Probably not a huge surprise to anybody. Absolutely incredible album, and this one would go down as my number one favorite Queens of the Stone Age record. I know it's a super cliche choice, but I think it's for very good reason why this album is held in such high regard, and I really think it is a masterpiece. Stylistically, this one picks up from where they left off on Rated R, but ventures into even heavier territories with bigger sounding guitars, fuller production, harder riffs and grooves, and in general just a very loud and aggressive album that really goes all in. And it's to be expected that the music is going to sound like that, with the record being titled Songs for the Deaf. And I think it's also worth noting that Dave Grohl is drumming on this album, and I think the energy that he brings fits perfectly with where they wanted to go on this one. And there are countless amazing drum grooves all throughout this track listing, with some of my personal favorites being First It Giveth and Hanging Tree, which is an odd meter groove in 5/8 time. And this is a loose concept album centered around being on a drive through the California desert, going from Los Angeles to Joshua Tree. And along the way, you're tuning into different radio stations from some of the different towns that you're driving through, which provides opportunities for these nice little detours and brief changes in mood and pace throughout this very loud and aggressive record. The album is 14 tracks long, and from beginning to end, it is just an awesome and intense journey, opening up with a short 90-second intro track, and then the music comes in on track 2, and then we are in for just an amazing ride from that point on. And this album spawned a couple of Queens of the Stone Age's most classic tracks with No One Knows and Go With The Flow, which are both incredible songs and would definitely be some of my favorites on here. But I do think the B-sides can even give these singles a run for their money, and this is one of those records where as I'm listening to it, I am constantly amazed at how many amazing tracks there are just right next to one another as you're going through this track listing. In addition to those 2 tracks that I just mentioned, my other personal favorites on here would be First It Giveth, The Sky Is Falling, Hanging Tree, and God Is in the Radio. If I had to pick a number 1 favorite track on here, I would have to go with First It Giveth. I love everything about that song. The cool groove, the hard-hitting and badass guitar riff with those eerie harmonies, and Josh's catchy falsetto vocal melody, which gives me vibes of a track that could have been on their self-titled debut album. Just a rock-solid song. And I also love how the album concludes with the hidden track Mosquito Song, which takes on a completely different style from the rest of the record, and is really the one break that we get from all of the loudness and the heaviness. And this track starts with just acoustic guitar and vocals, and then they introduce accordion, strings, and horns, and it's just a beautifully arranged track, and one of the first examples of seeing what kinds of sounds they develop when they experiment with different instrument pairings and take a detour out of that alt rock and alt metal styling. And that is a shift in mood that we will see more on certain songs and certain records in the future, probably mostly on Like Clockwork, where I think they explore that to the fullest extent that they have. But I think this song is one of the first examples where we really hear that, and it's a very cool and sort of palate cleansing way to conclude this very awesome and intense journey of an album. The only track on here that I've never been able to really get into is Another Love Song. That's the one song that I feel like could have been omitted from this record and it would have been fine. And with Nick doing the vocal stylings that he is on this track, it just strikes me as a little bit out of place, but that's just my opinion. I don't necessarily think that it needs to be on here. I don't really think it adds anything to the album. And it's one of those tracks where no matter how many times I listen to it, it just never grows on me. And I'm curious if anybody else feels the same way about this song, or if you have another song that you dislike on this track listing. Because for me, when I listen to records, it is very rare that there's an album where every single song from front to back is incredible. Usually there's at least one skip over track for me, and on this record it is that particular one. And if it wasn't for this track, I do think that this album would be completely perfect from front to back. But obviously it's only one track over the course of 14 songs, which is very good, and the quality of the remainder of the album is just so incredibly strong that one track really does not take away from this album very much at all. And I think this is by far their most consistent album from front to back, with the most standout tracks, and of all of their records, this one would have the most amount of songs that would make my top 10 favorite Queens of the Stone Age song list. I just think they knocked it out of the park with this one and produced the best album of their discography. So an incredible record, my number one favorite Queens of the Stone Age album. This one gets an easy S. All right, next we have their fourth studio album from 2005 titled Lullabies to Paralyze, and I'm going to give this one an A. This is an album that a lot of Queens of the Stone Age fans are divided on, and some people put this pretty low on their list, but I think that this album is very good. It resonates with me a lot, and I do think it is better than some people give it credit for. Stylistically, it does take a bit of a detour from Songs for the Deaf. This album still has plenty of heavy and loud tracks, but dynamically and stylistically, there is a bit more variety happening throughout this, and they're definitely venturing off into some different territories that we haven't heard up to this point. And one of the reasons why I think this album doesn't resonate with some people is because of the fact that it's the record to follow Songs for the Deaf, which is an almost impossible album to follow. And because of that, I do think that some people may view this record as being worse than it actually is. It runs a similar length to Songs for the Deaf. It's almost 60 minutes long and it's 14 tracks, and I do think the majority of the songs on here are very good. Like I said, plenty of variety and surprise from track to track, and it does have a handful of songs that I would regard as really exceptional Queens of the Stone Age songs, with my favorites being Everybody Knows That You Are Insane, Tangled Up in Plaid, Burn the Witch, In My Head, and The Blood Is Love. I think these kinds of tracks do a great job of incorporating the elements that people loved from Songs for the Deaf, but also adding some new elements of surprise and new stylistic territories that we hadn't heard them explore up to this point. And I think because of the branching out that they do throughout this record, it's naturally not going to appeal to everybody, and I could definitely understand why people who resonate more with Rated R and Songs for the Deaf might not be as big of a fan of this record. But for me personally, I do think that the quality of the songwriting is still very high throughout this, and it does have about 2 to 3 tracks that would make my list of top 10, maybe top 15 favorite Queens of the Stone Age songs. My main critique that I will give this record, and my main reasoning for putting it in A tier, is that I do think it is a tad longer than it needs to be. Songs for the Deaf was a similar length, and I think it was justified for being as long as it was. But this record does have a few tracks here and there that I could do without, and I think if it had been condensed down to maybe 11 tracks, I think that could have enhanced it even more. But actually, the 3 tracks that I don't care for on this record all happen back to back, and it is actually the final 3 songs with Broken Box, You Got a Killer Scene There Man, and Long Slow Goodbye. I find those 3 to be the most underwhelming tracks of the record, and I just think the final chunk of this album is definitely the weakest part, but I do think the first 11 songs are very solid and consistent and do carry the album enough for it to warrant getting it put into A tier. I do think it is a little downgrade from Songs for the Deaf and Rated R, but I also do like it more than Self-Titled, and I think with Rated R and Songs for the Deaf being the 2 albums that preceded it, I think they did a really good job of following up 2 very hard to follow albums. So a great album in my opinion, and better than a lot of people give it credit for. I will give this an A. Okay, moving on, we have their 5th studio album from 2007 titled Era Vulgaris, and I will give this a B. I think this album is pretty good, but I do think it is a bit of a downgrade from Lullabies to Paralyze, and I definitely wouldn't say that it reaches the same highs that Rated R and Songs for the Deaf do. And with Songs for the Deaf being inspired largely by Josh driving through the Southern California deserts, this record was actually more inspired by Josh and his daily drives through Hollywood. And compositionally, this one is in a similar realm to Lullabies to Paralyze, with a lot of stylistic variety from track to track. We're also hearing some more electronic components being introduced on select songs, and the production is definitely different as well, and that is one thing that I'm not always crazy about with this record, particularly with the guitar sounds. I'd much prefer the way the tone and the production of the guitars are on the previous 4 records, and that's always been one point of contention for me with this album. And don't get me wrong, there are some great tracks throughout this, but I also think that the quality in the songwriting is a little downgraded on this one, with a couple of more skip over, underwhelming tracks than the previous records had for me. It's got 11 songs, and I would say I enjoy probably a little over half of the songs on this record. I'm not particularly crazy about the opening track, Turnin' on the Screw, and I'm also not a huge fan of Into the Hollow, Battery Acid, and the closer, Run Pig Run. I would say those are the weakest points of the album and do ultimately take away from the momentum a bit. I do think some of the other songs are very solid, though, with my favorite being I'm Designer. I absolutely love the vibe of that track. And a couple of other favorites would be Suture Up Your Future, Threes and Sevens, and River in the Road. So this record definitely still has a handful of tracks that I do think redeem it, but like I said, up to this point, I do think this is their most underwhelming release, with the largest amount of skip over tracks for me personally. I know a lot of people tend to regard this and Lullabies to Paralyze as some of their weaker albums, but I definitely do resonate more with Lullabies to Paralyze from a stylistic and song perspective, and I find that a chunk of this record does tend to fall flat for me, and is ultimately why I bumped it down a tier. So I would say it's an okay album, pretty good, but not amazing, so I will give this a B. Okay, next we have their 6th studio album from 2013 titled Like Clockwork, and this one gets an easy S. I absolutely love this record, and this would go down as my second favorite Queens of the Stone Age album. I love everything that they did on this one, and I think this is their most dynamic and versatile album of their discography. In the year prior to this record, Josh had been hospitalized and bedridden for 4 months after unexpected complications during a knee surgery, and following this incident, it had brought the band back together to work on this album, and I think it resulted in one of the best albums of their discography, with a very focused, clear, and concise sound from front to back. Musically, I would say this is their most dynamic and adventurous album to date, with really every different element to their sound, in addition to further expansions to their style with lots of variety in dynamics and instrumentation. And I think this record has something to offer for every different type of Queens of the Stone Age fan. It is 10 tracks long, and I absolutely love the way it opens up with Keep Your Eyes Peeled, a super cool song with this great groove to it and awesome guitar riffs, and a song that has a nice energy to it, but also creates this nice sense of anticipation for the album. I think stylistically it was the perfect track choice for the opening song, and it would go down as one of my favorite opening tracks of any Queens of the Stone Age album. And from that point on, it is one incredible song after the next. Nice contrasting moods with varying dynamics, like the piano-centered track, The Vampire of Time and Memory, and Calopsia, which alternates between a mellow piano and electronic section and a heavier part, and the closing title track, Like Clockwork, opens up with some beautiful piano and vocal work, and then features some tasteful slide guitar, and eventually climaxes into this intense, heavy final blowout, which dies back down into the mellow and spacey vibes to conclude the album. I just love the wide range of dynamics and different instrumentations throughout these tracks, and when it comes to that side of their songwriting style, I do think that this album is where they do that the most effectively, and from beginning to end, I don't think there is a single bad song on this record. My personal favorite track on here is I Appear Missing. To me, that is the perfect second to last track with such a great intensity to it, and it would definitely make my list of top 10 favorite Queens songs. My other favorites on here are My God Is the Sun, I Sat by the Ocean, and the opener, Keep Your Eyes Peeled, which, like I said, is one of my favorite opening tracks of any Queens of the Stone Age album. And like I said, I think this album is just incredibly consistent. Every song serves a very important purpose, and the contrast from song to song makes for a very enjoyable and adventurous listen that really showcases all of the best sides of the Queens of the Stone Age sound and further expands upon it and gives us some new flavors that we hadn't heard up to this point. And I do think the difficult circumstances in Josh's life prior to making this record definitely inspired some of the best songwriting that they've done since Songs for the Deaf, in my opinion. And this one goes down as my second favorite Queens of the Stone Age record, like I said. So an incredible album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their 7th studio album from 2017 titled Villains, and unfortunately I'm going to give this one a C. I have a hard time with a lot of this record. I do find it pretty underwhelming and some of the least interesting music that they've written to date, and this goes down as my least favorite Queens of the Stone Age album. It's 9 tracks long, and while there are some good moments here and there and a couple of individual songs that I don't think are bad, I do think the majority of this album is pretty weak, and a lot of these songs really don't do much for me. And this is one of those records that I have listened to multiple times and really given it a chance to see if it would grow on me eventually, and nothing ever seems to click, and I'm always kind of left with the same general feelings about it. Really, the only song on here that I would say is, a really solid track would be The Way You Used to Do. But even with that song, in the grand scheme of the Queens of the Stone Age discography, I wouldn't say that's a track that I would regard as one of my top songs by them. But in the context of this album, I would say that is by far the best track. The other couple of songs on here that I do think are good, but I wouldn't say are anything exceptional, are Fortress, Hideaway, and the closer, Villains of Circumstance. But other than those handful of tracks, I do find the remainder of this album pretty boring. And songwriting-wise, I think this is some of their most generic and contrived sounding material up to this point, with not a ton of new sounds to really engage the listener and bring them in. And I think when you look at a record like this in comparison to what came before it with Like Clockwork, I think that really articulates how much of a dip in quality the songwriting took on here, because for me, Like Clockwork is one of those records where you're just on the edge of your seat the whole time, having no idea where they're going to take you from one track to the next. And when I listen to this one, I just don't get that feeling at all. Instead, I just feel like it's a collection of songs that really don't stand up in comparison to everything else from their discography. And like I said at the beginning of this video, there is a ton of diversity of thought within the Queens of the Stone Age community, but this is one record that a lot of people do mutually seem to regard as their worst album. But at the same time, I have seen a few people here and there that do love it, but I have always fallen more into the less favorable camp when it comes to this record, and I do consider it to be a significant downgrade from Like Clockwork, and like I said, it's my least favorite Queens of the Stone Age album. So not a great album, unfortunately, in my opinion. This one gets a C. Alright, and lastly, we have their 8th and most recent studio album from 2023 titled In Times New Roman. And I might surprise some people with this one, but I'm going to give this an A. This is an album that a lot of fans seem to be divided on. Some people rank it pretty low, and when I initially heard it, I thought it was good, but nothing special. But this was a record that definitely grew on me the more and more I listened to it, and I do think this album is much better than some people give it credit for, and definitely a significant improvement from Villains, in my opinion. And leading up to this album, it was a pretty turbulent time in Josh Homme's life. He had gotten separated from his wife in 2019 due to his alcoholism and drug abuse, which would lead him to go to rehab, and then a custody battle would ensue, which would eventually result in Josh getting sole custody of his kids and getting a restraining order against his ex-wife. And if this couldn't be enough to deal with already, he had then been diagnosed with cancer in 2022, but successfully beat it through surgery. So it was not a very peaceful couple of years for Josh, but I think he managed to take a lot of that turmoil and produce a really solid album out of it, similar to what he did with Like Clockwork. This record is 10 tracks long, and I think it sounds very fresh, and for 8 albums into their discography, they are writing some very high quality stuff that doesn't sound contrived or predictable like I thought a lot of Villains had sounded. The album is filled with heavy and gritty guitar riffs, catchy hooks, colorful vocal melodies, and hard-hitting drum grooves. I think the production on this one is much more true to the Queens of the Stone Age sound, with the very massive sounding guitars that really capture that hard-hitting edge that I love. I also love the intricate rhythmic concepts going on in some of these guitar riffs with the use of polyrhythms, or riffs where beat 1 isn't always totally clear from the beginning on tracks like Time and Place, Obscenery, and Emotion Sickness. And in general, I think musically there's just a lot more stuff to sink your teeth into all throughout this. I really think almost every track from front to back is very solid. I wouldn't say that the highs on this record are as jaw-dropping as the highs of any of the records in S tier, and that is my main reasoning for putting it in A tier. But for an album this far into their discography, I think it sounds incredibly fresh, refined, and gives me everything that I want to hear from a great Queens of the Stone Age album. My personal favorite track on here by far is Emotion Sickness, which would also probably make my list of top 5 favorite Queens of the Stone Age songs. I think that song is absolutely incredible and has one of the catchiest choruses of any Queen song, in my opinion, and that is one point that is massively in favor of this album for me. And my other favorites would be the opener, Obscenery, which I think brings the record in beautifully, and I also love Negative Space and Sicily. But in general, I have very little problems with this record. Like I said, I think it's a big improvement from Villains. I think the band is in top form all throughout this. It's got a really solid batch of tracks, and I do think this is a lot better than a lot of people give it credit for. And if you're not a huge fan of this one, I would recommend giving it a few more listens, because I do think it will grow on you over time like it did with me. So a very good album. I will give this one an A. All right, we did it. We went through their 8 studio albums, and this is what I came up with. It was really such an enjoyable experience going back and re-listening to these records to really solidify my thoughts on how I felt about each of them. And for anybody who hasn't checked out the entire Queens of the Stone Age discography, I think it is well worth exploring. Even if there are going to be albums here and there that you might not resonate with, I think all of them offer some unique stuff for a variety of different types of music listeners, and there are tons of great individual tracks all throughout these records, and I am sure that we will be hearing much more of them in the future. And with how much I liked their 2023 release, I am very excited to see what type of songwriting trajectory Josh and the band will take on any future records that will come out. This is a band that has clearly stood the test of time and has not lost their magic one bit, and are still fully capable of writing some amazing and unique music that is unlike anything else that you will ever hear, and I'm very glad to have covered them for today's episode. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable, and if you are interested, please feel free to check out my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the description. I am sure there will be plenty of other videos that you will enjoy, so check those out. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 8 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, that is it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.